So today we're going to talk about Hatsepsut, who many might argue is Egypt's greatest female king, Egypt's greatest leader of state who was also a woman. We can mess with that a little in our minds as we get to Cleopatra and make it a bit of a battle royale, who was better, who was not. I think the easy solution for now is to say that Hatshepsut was born into a time of prosperity, took power in a time of prosperity and plenty. Cleopatra did not. It was easier for Hatshepsut to leave Egypt better than she found it. For Cleopatra, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. But Cleopatra follows that pattern of a woman taking power in a time period of crisis. There's no one left to rule. What do we do? Oh, no, there's a woman. Okay. Hatshepsut, on the other hand, takes power in a moment of just succession crisis. No one's invading. There's nothing bad happening internally that we can really see, except that you have a king that's too young to rule. And the fact that she was able to do that might bump her over the edge for me in my own personal battle royale of who wins this female contest of power. Of course, we shouldn't make it a contest, right? We don't need to. We're all winners if we could make it to leader of state at all. So first, let's start out with how to pronounce the name Hatshepsut, because I told you I would help you learn to do this, and it's a bit of a tongue twister. It's a bit of a tongue twister for a reason. Cleopatra is not an easy name to pronounce necessarily either, but it rolls off the tongue a little more easily because it's a part of your cultural memory, because Elizabeth Taylor was in movies playing her, because Shakespeare wrote plays about Cleopatra, because, as I said in previous weeks, we like to discuss and aggrandize the female who is the cautionary tale of power. Hatshepsut, on the other hand, was so damn successful that the men who came after her took credit for everything that she herself had done, did so quite easily, because success is quite an exchangeable thing. Everyone wants it. Everyone wants to say, oh, I did that. Wait till you guys are all in workplace meetings and the female says something and then a guy 2 weeks later takes credit for that idea that she came up with. Studies have shown that this happens. Hatshepsut, because she was so successful, because the men erased her after, her name has been very much expunged from our cultural memory. She's being resurrected now, sure, but her name is not something that just, that falls off the tongue very easily. So the trick that I like to use is Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut. Hat, foremost of, Shezep, the precious ones, Shezepsut. So the foremost of precious women is what her name means. Essentially, her name it's like naming your daughter Portia in a way. You automatically know what class of society she belongs to. You know what her education level is. You know that she is expected to move into a certain milieu. Hatshepsut, foremost of precious and elite women, is her name. Now, let's situate her in time and space. Space is pretty easy. She ruled Egypt. She probably ruled from her capital cities of Memphis and Heliopolis there at the apex of the Delta and the Nile Valley. But she also ruled quite a bit at Thebes. And most of the information we have for Hatshepsut comes from Thebes, which is a very annoying part of the Egyptologists' story, that our preservation of Egypt is often from the south, which was less influential in terms of political rule than up towards the apex of the Nile and the Delta. But because ancient Memphis and ancient Heliopolis are underneath the modern sprawling city of Cairo, we have much less information about these places. Much fewer blocks from old temples, because those things might have been broken down for lime kilns in the 19th century AD or something else. So there's just more data from Thebes, but I don't want you to think that that was necessarily her center of power. Now, let's look at the main patterns of Hatshepsut, which we did already a bit last class, but we'll situate her again. She is king's daughter, born to Thutmose I. King's sister, marries Thutmose II. So that means king's wife as well. So she's got the trifecta, but she does not have king's mother, because she never has a son with her half-brother husband, Thutmose II. She only has a daughter, Nefru. And because of that lack of a son, she has a very interesting and circuitous journey protecting a child as king who is not her own. Because essentially what happens is that in her husband brother's year 3, and trust me, there is a ton of debate over how long Thutmose II ruled. We're not going to go into those details here for this class. It's not that important for the purposes at hand. But in her husband brother's year 3, he dies unexpectedly. And an examination of the mummy shows that he had an enlarged heart, and maybe he wasn't the healthiest guy on the planet either. And he leaves Hatshepsut and all of Egypt with a harem nursery filled with 2-year-olds. 2.5-year-olds, 1.5-year-olds. Not one of those sons is Hatshepsut's. They all belong to other women. And Egypt is plunged into a succession crisis. Now, put this into context with what happened earlier in the 18th dynasty that we discussed. End of the 17th dynasty was a full brother-sister incestuous marriage. Beginning of the 18th dynasty, full brother-sister incestuous marriage that did produce a child who could produce no progeny. That's Amenhotep I. Because no progeny could be produced, Ahmose Nefertari, who was his regent when he was young and then protector when he died, it seems, brought in Thutmose I, a grown man, to come in and be king of Egypt. This grown man was Hatshepsut's father. So Egypt in the 18th dynasty had already been through a series of self-made shots in the foot, if you like, succession crises, most of them brought on by incest. This one could very easily have been brought on by incest as well. Hatshepsut and Thutmose II were half-brother and sister, and so maybe their biological production was not helped by that fact. A son was not born to them within that 3-year time span, though they did have a daughter in a 3-year time span for one child. I mean, it's a reasonably effective production. But we have another succession crisis, one after another after another. The ancient Egyptian elites of the early 18th dynasty were probably like, oh, come on, not again. The ones who could remember the last time there was a succession crisis, when Amenhotep I died childless and this other man had to be brought in to rule over Egypt. They're going through it all again. And it seems there's a choice. There's a choice to either do what had happened with Thutmose I, bring in a grown man, mature, able to make decisions, no problem, or continue with the royal line. And it seems that Egypt, for all of its divine kingship, ideological belief systems, has no choice, is compelled to follow the divine kingship, even if it's a 2-year-old that's being chosen as king. And so this 2-year-old is chosen, and Hatshepsut is now thrown into the situation of acting as regent for this king, making all of the decisions on behalf of this boy. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, wait, Professor Cooney, I don't understand. Why is Hatshepsut acting as regent for this boy? Why is the mother not acting as regent for this boy? And you would have a great question if that popped into your brain. It is an odd thing, and it doesn't fit with the agendas and patterns of much of what we've seen before. It would make more sense to have this 2-year-old who is chosen, his name will be to Egyptologists Thutmose III, have his mother as his regent, but he doesn't. Hatshepsut acts as regent, and we'll look at all of the details of how that occurred in a bit. We're already seeing agendas that are splitting. So instead of a mother acting as regent on behalf of her son, wanting him to grow up into the kingship, wanting to protect him into maturity so that she can step back, Hatshepsut doesn't necessarily want that, or her agenda is not going to be the same as the boy's because the boy is not her son. So that as he gets older, there's going to be some competition maybe between his entourage and her entourage. There seems to be enough of a problem that by year 7 of Thutmose III, and again, that chronology is contested by Egyptologists as well, and you can imagine they've written all kinds of articles saying, no, it was year 2, no, it was year 3. It's fine. We're going to, in this class, say year 7. But in year 7, Hatshepsut is crowned king. She's been regent for some time, calling all the shots, being the decision maker. Then she's crowned king. We'll look at all of the details of that in just a moment as well. So we're talking about a very interesting pattern of events. Egypt is prosperous. It is successful. But there's a 2-year-old, and how are we going to deal with it? It seems that the elites and the priests who are calling the shots behind the scenes, and they don't talk about any of their decision-making in a way that we can see, decide they want to put their chips all in with Hatshepsut. And so they choose a boy whose mother and family are less influential so that Hatshepsut can be the decision maker. Maybe they think they can even control Hatshepsut themselves. Maybe they think that they have influenced her up to this point. Maybe when she was ruling with Thutmose II, her half-brother husband, she was a kind of decision maker behind the scenes. And they want to continue that situation. All of those details are shielded from our eyes. This is the perfected and idealized Egyptian kingship of authoritarianism that is shown to us. And we have to know that there was realpolitik going on here, but we can't know exactly what the details are. The very fact that Hatshepsut is the one chosen to be regent is odd and strange, should cause us to pause. The fact that she becomes king alongside a mere boy who's 9 years old, more or less when she's crowned in year 7, is even stranger. Something's going on that we can't see, that we can't understand, but she becomes king. She rules altogether, regency and kingship, for about 22 years. And this is one of the, if not the longest rule. Some people say Cleopatra ruled for about 22 years. The two really do line up in terms of reign time period. But like Cleopatra, Hatshepsut also never rules alone. This is a pattern that we will see followed throughout this class. If we see a long-ruled female, she will have a male accompaniment next to her in some way or form all the time throughout her reign. So if we look at Empress Le of China, she's ruling next to husband, then son, then grandson. If we look at Cleopatra, she's ruling next to father, then brother, then Roman general, and son. If we look at Hatshepsut, essentially, she's haunted by Thutmose III her entire reign. She can't escape him. She's always ruling with him. If there is some crass feminist part of me that wishes she had had him eliminated, assassinated, killed, so that she could rule alone, I don't think there's anything wrong with thinking about these things hypothetically. I think Hatshepsut herself knew that if she tried to do such a thing, it would result in her ruin and loss of power very, very quickly. It would have precipitated a loss of power. Hatshepsut, I think, was canny enough politically to know that having that boy there was indeed her ticket to power. So she needed the boy there. When he's 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, easy, schmeezy, not a problem. She can rule and be the decision maker and utterly control him. Once he becomes 9 or 10 or 11, his entourage is growing in maturity. He himself is growing in maturity. It's going to be a little more difficult to control this child. That's also the time when she becomes king. When he's around 9, year 7, she is crowned, formalized in her power in a way that is irrevocable. Can't step away from this. You're not going to abdicate this Egyptian divine kingship. She will rule until her death. So she knew that she couldn't have this kid eliminated. She had to rule alongside him as he got older. That, I think, is the most extraordinary part of Hatshepsut's story, is watching her change her methodology, rules, and even the representation of herself to match the boy that she's ruling alongside. It becomes quite obvious to everyone and to you as you go through this analysis that Hatshepsut was never ruling alone, that she was always ruling alongside this boy. Sometimes it was easier for her, sometimes she had to match him, and it was a little more difficult. So another pattern that Hatshepsut fulfills is that she does not leave her own progeny after her death. She rules for a long period of time. She never rules alone. She also does not leave her own son on the throne. Indeed, her lack of a son is her very reason for being on the throne in the first place. But essentially what I'm saying is that even though she may have been of childbearing age, when she was wielding this power, she does not take on a lover, produce a pregnancy, and try to move that son into a position of power after her death. In fact, the lineage moves to her nephew, Thutmose III, and it follows him to the end of the 18th dynasty. Now, Hatshepsut has a foundation of power that Thutmose III's mother didn't have. If we're questioning why was Hatshepsut able to become regent when the boy's mother could not, we should look at what she possessed that made her so much more essential, a better leader in the eyes of the elites and courtiers and priests who are part of the decision about who would be regent, who they would be happy with as regent. The main difference is that, well, she's king's daughter. That's a pretty big one, right? She's not only king's daughter, but she takes on a high position of priestly authority during the reign of her father, Thutmose I. Again, there's scholarly disagreement about this, but I think there's enough circumstantial evidence to show that she was named as high priestess during the reign of her father as an extension of her father's rule. Works with the system. It's what Sargon of Akkad did with his daughter Enkiduana. It's what other kings will do with females when they place them into positions of ideological authority. So Hatshepsut is placed into that position of ideological authority. A high priestess, yes, but also a kind of infiltrator of a very inward-looking, controlled high priesthood. She's moved into Thebes and the temple of Karnak, temple of Amun-Re, and she is the god's wife of Amun. She is there to make sure that the god is reborn every day, that his creation happens as it should. She has, in this position, palaces of her own, economic foundation of her own, an income of her own. She has stewards, she has officials working for her. If she takes this position on in the reign of her father, she, from a very young age, is going to have an authority and an education at the very highest levels. So it will not be too hard for her, even as a girl, 16 or 17 years of age, to move into the position of regent. She's already been in an authoritarian position within a temple for some time. So if Egypt needs her to expand that, she can. Even more than that, though, remember what Michael Mann says about ideological power, that it cannot be proven nor disproven, and it is thus the most powerful of the social powers. We will see Hatshepsut use her position as priestess to Amun-Re to tell her people, the God wants me to do this. The God wants me to rule. The God wanted me to rule as the regent of Egypt, and now the God wants me to rule as king of Egypt. And when you say it that way, and when you manufacture an oracle so that Amun-Re comes out of the temple and chooses Hatshepsut as chief ruler of Egypt, what are the people going to say? It's really an unassailable justification for power. And she's setting herself up quite nicely from this ideological foundation of power to take more power as her time in Egypt continues. Now, the image that you see here shows Hatshepsut being given life and power by the god Seth. Seth is this weird mythical creature, aardvark-like god, weird long snout and these weird rabbit-like ears. But she is being presented by another goddess and is given this life and power by a god of storms, a god of great might. This is Hatshepsut before she became king. It's Hatshepsut as queen. But we can see that she's interacting one-on-one with the gods nonetheless. She's moving from a position of power to another position of power. Hatshepsut has a political and ideological position of power before she even moves into the regency. The Egyptians do give us some textual understanding of how this happened. So let's do a close text reading of the tomb autobiography of Aneni. He had this inscribed in hieroglyphic text on the walls of his tomb chapel. People could come in and visit it. They could read it. He meant for this to be published. Keep in mind that he has an agenda to make this public and to make his connection to Hatshepsut known to every other elite in Egypt who sees this in the Theban region. So we see here, Thutmose II went up to heaven and he united with the gods. So Aneni tells us that Thutmose II has died. This is Hatshepsut's half-brother husband. His son was raised in his place as king of the two lands. He ruled upon the throne of the one who begat him. So Aneni tells us that Thutmose III is ruling on the throne of his father, that the linear succession from father to son has happened as it should. But notice he doesn't name the next king. Do you see a Thutmose there? No, he doesn't name the next king at all. But he does name Hatshepsut. So you can see which side his bread is buttered on, if you will, that mentioning the new king is not important to him. This new king is a 2-year-old. Mentioning Hatshepsut, however, the decision maker of the land, is indeed very important to him because he says his sister, and this would be Thutmose II's sister, the god's wife of Amun, Hatsepsut, fulfilled the needs of the land, the two lands following her counsels. So he's clear to give us her ideological foundation of power, to call her God's wife, to give her her authority through that position. But he also links her to the dead king, as the title sister clarifies. He can't link Hatsepsut to her nephew because nephew isn't a title that's direct. It's not a title that's going to help her. Remember what I said about kingship in ancient Egypt and how you have king's daughters, king's wives, king's sisters, king's mothers. You don't have king's aunts. It's not something you're going to see. You want to be one step removed, not multiple steps removed from the center of the wheel of power. So for Eneni to point out that Hatsepsut is the kid's aunt or stepmother, if you like, who knows if stepmother is even appropriate given the harem and how this works, he needs to leave that relationship unspoken. And so it's easier for him to say, oh no, she's God's wife of Ammon. This is her entree to power. This is her foundation for it. And then he tells us that she does this very well. In a couple of lines here, you can see there's money pouring into Egypt. She's giving orders. They're good orders. And people are following those orders. Just because she's young doesn't mean that people are trying to move against her. He's telling us that everything is working in the way that it should. Now, skip down to the last couple of lines in this tomb autobiography, because to me, this is the most essential part for how Hatshepsut was able to get her power as regent and then get more power as female king. He says here, "Her Majesty praised me, and she loved me. She knew my excellence in the palace. She provided me with things, and she made me great." Now, this for me is the key of Hatshepsut's power. Remember, there's always this balance between the elites and the king. King can't have whatever he or she wants. The elites can't have whatever they want. Sometimes the elites are more powerful in a given time period. Sometimes the king is more powerful. Hatshepsut's time period is a rebalancing. And Egyptologists can even see this on the ground. They can see that people like Eneni, other elites, officials, priests, and courtiers have more tombs, more statuary, more reliefs, more stuff of higher quality in Egypt. More stuff that they're displaying to their friends and their family in very public places. They are being given more income. There's more titles. There's more officials than had ever been seen in ancient Egypt before. In other words, Hatshepsut or Hatshepsut and her advisors are having to give a lot to the elites to get her power. And there is a rejiggering of the balance. If during the reign of her father, Thutmose I, the elites were a little bit down here, without as many statues, without as many tombs and all of that fabulous stuff, during the joint reign of Thutmose III and Hatshepsut, with this succession crisis, kind of moves like this. The elites get a lot more economic influence and a lot more political influence. And Eneni is telling us that quite baldly, quite openly. Look, you know, the queen, the God's wife of Ammon, Hatshepsut, she digs my work. She loves me. She thinks I'm awesome. And you know what, you guys? She totally made me rich. She gave me all this stuff. She helped me buy this tomb that you're looking at right now. You know, my family's just completely rich now because of Hatshepsut. We think she's awesome. And you see the manufacturing of political following with this text. Not everything is about gods and succession and the Egyptians just doing whatever they're going to do to the god Amun-Re. So much of what people do is about, well, what are you going to give me? What's my payoff? And Eneni tells us right here, Hatshepsut had to give money to get his loyalty. She got it. She probably had to do that to other people as well. Eneni can't have been the only one. So the regency in ancient Egypt, let me stop a little bit and discuss what the regency in ancient Egypt was and why it's different in Hatshepsut's case. It's meant to be an ironclad way of keeping the succession safe by linking agendas between a mother ruling on behalf of her son. For whatever reason, that's not working in this situation. The regency is continuing, but it's not a mother-son situation, but rather an aunt-nephew situation between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. The weird thing about the regency that I have to bang into the heads of students who are taking this class is that it is never formalized. You don't get a title when you become regent. You just saw in that inscription from Eneni, he calls her the God's wife of Amun. He calls her what she was before and what she continues to be after. She just happens to be making all of the decisions. It is an informal position of power. It's problematic, right? You can get kicked out of an informal position of power. People can come in and say, well, you're just not going to be making those decisions anymore. They can slowly move you aside. The regency position is a very precarious place for a woman to be. And for Hatsepsut, it was no different. More precarious because she's not the kid's mother. The image that I'm showing you here is a statue of Thutmose III's mother, Isis. And you may wonder how she was pushed aside so easily. I wonder this all the time. We're never given any details about it. We actually have a statue of her preserved, and it shows her as a beautiful woman. She has a gilded modius crown. She has 2 uraei that show her queenship. But she's named only king's mother. She's never there as a political power dealer in Thebes at this time period. Maybe Thutmose III himself was chosen as king by those who were part of this decision because she was so uninfluential, uneducated, just a pretty young thing in the harem. Maybe her son, Thutmose III, was chosen because her family was uneducated and provincial and not part of power deal-making in the capitals of power. We don't know these details. They're shielded from our eyes, but we know that she wasn't there in the regency position. And then the final point about Hatshepsut's regency that is so very interesting and is a game changer for her is that the regency was very, very long. A 2-year-old king is kind of ridiculous for the ancient world when you think about it. You may be like, well, why, Professor Cooney? What's the problem? You just crown the 2-year-old. Yes, it might be hard to get the crown on him. And yeah, he's probably messing around and chewing on stuff the whole time and not listening to instructions and wandering away. That might be difficult. But what's the problem? You crown the 2-year-old in multiple places in Egypt and Hatshepsut's ruling things, you're good to go. Well, everyone in the ancient world would have held half of their children in their arms dying as they're turning blue from lack of oxygen or from some sort of epidemic or some intestinal malady or something. Some scourge that's just taken out half of a village may have taken out a number of their children recently. Everybody in the ancient world would have been aware of how fragile life was, especially before the age of 5, especially after you wean the child from breastfeeding. There are a number of danger spots for a young child. For a child to make it out of the age of 5 or the age of 7 was a real triumph. And you're crowning a 2-year-old, and you're expecting a status quo to continue from that? There would have been a number of people looking at this situation and just saying, this is mad. This is crazy. Not only that, you're giving a regent a regency that's going to last 14 years potentially. Is she going to live to see this through? You crown a 2-year-old and you want him to move into his mature years. 14 years seems reasonable to me until the kid's 16 years old. That's a tremendous amount of power to give to a young 16-year-old, 17, 18-year-old girl and to allow her to mature and grow into. So we're talking about a lot of interesting power politics during the joint reign of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. She's going to have to, as you will see, fit the changing circumstances of her co-king, fit the kingship itself. The most interesting thing about Hatshepsut is that you can see her political understanding that she can't expect the kingship to be what she wants it to be. She needs to fit herself into the kingship. She is the ultimate traditionalist. She does everything right. She leaves Egypt better than she finds it. All of that in the end might end up being her undoing, in a sense.